President Biden, as you no doubt have heard, is expected to announce his Supreme Court nominee by the end of this month. For more, let us bring in New York Representative Mondaire Jones. So, Congressman, it's great to be with you. He joins us, by the way, from White Plains, New York. So, Congressman, big picture, because as you know and I know, Washington can really take the shine off history pretty quickly. It can get cynical and highly politicized right off the bat. Describe the historical significance of this moment. The United States of America waiting for the first African-American woman nominee to the Supreme Court.
Well, Major, it's great to be with you. This nomination is of tremendous importance in the arc of American history. A lot of folks don't know that there's never been an African-American woman to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. And in fact, prior to the confirmation of Thurgood Marshall in the year 1967, all Supreme Court justices had been white men. And so this is an important moment. I'm proud of the president for his leadership. Obviously, representative government requires that we have folks who reflect the lived experiences of all Americans, not just in the legislature and in the executive branch of government, but on the high court itself, in the judiciary branch. You know, there is evidence that, from Sandra Day O'Connor, for example, that she learned from Justice Thurgood Marshall's experiences that he shared with her while they served together on the bench.
Do you have a preferred candidate? And I know, as a member of the House of Representatives, your voice would be important but not decisive, but I'm just curious. Do you have a preferred candidate?
Well, I'd like to think that I have a decisive opinion on the matter, too. Look, the great thing about the president's decision to make history by nominating an African-American woman to serve on the court is that there is a universe, an entire universe of highly qualified potential candidates. Here's what I'm looking for beyond the history. I'm looking for professional diversity. There's not been a civil rights attorney serving on the bench, at least in this moment. There is no public defender serving on the bench in this moment. I've also been circulating a letter with Andy Levin, my colleague from Michigan, talking about the need to appoint someone who has a strong history of supporting the right to organize. We know that the right to organize, the right to unionize has been under attack by the far right justices on the Supreme Court over the past several decades. And so the great thing about choosing an African-American woman is that you can also choose someone who's got the professional diversity on top of the racial and gender diversity.
So, Congressman, I want to ask you to respond to the Republican criticism heard in some quarters that President Biden has, from their perspective, lessened the significance of this pick by limiting his options to African-American women. The implication being that choice is coming before what would otherwise be a search for the most sterling legal qualifications.
Well, I'm concerned when I hear that from a number of my Republican colleagues in the Senate, because it presumes that by virtue of being an African-American woman, a candidate will automatically not be qualified to serve on the court. And I would inquire further as to what they mean in their conclusion. The fact is, the names that have been floated already include people who have clerked on the Supreme Court themselves, which is about the highest honor you can get in the legal profession, in addition to going to some of the greatest law schools in the nation. So it is without basis, their critique. And of course, we've seen this before. Republican senators in particular have made a number of arguments about the Supreme Court that they have gone back on themselves. We know that Mitch McConnell left a vacancy open for 14 months after the death of Antonin Scalia, only to go back on the same rule that he had created by rushing through the confirmation of Justice Amy Coney Barrett, even as ballots were being cast as a presidential election was underway in the fall of 2020.
Congressman, before Justice Breyer announced his intention to retire at the end of this term, there was a lot of conversation about Democrats being in the doldrums. In oversimplified, possibly crass political terms, Is this the kind of rallying moment Democrats need, this idea of filling a vacancy and rallying around an African-American woman on the high court?
Look, I think baseline, we've got to make sure that the far-right 6-3 majority on the court, which is hostile to democracy itself, does not get reinforcements in this critical moment where racist voter suppression is on the rise because of a series of decisions of this far-right majority. And so it's not going to change the balance of the court to replace the incredible Justice Breyer with an African-American jurist. It is going to require adding seats to the Supreme Court to protect fundamental rights like the right to vote and the right of a woman to choose what to do with her own body, which is also at stake in this election. And so it's why folks like myself, specifically myself, Jerry Nadler, and Hank Johnson in Congress, as well as Ed Markey in the Senate, have introduced what's called the Judiciary Act of 2021, which would add 4 seats to the Supreme Court and restore balance to a broken institution that is hostile to a number of fundamental rights.
And on that point, why 4? Why kick it up to 13? And do you feel there's any prospect for that legislation getting to President Biden's desk?
Well, since our introduction of this legislation on Thursday, April 15th, a majority of Americans, 56%, polled in September of last year, agreed with the statement that we must add seats to the Supreme Court to protect reproductive rights. Of course, I mentioned the voter suppression that is underway. Well, that's only been allowed because of a 2013 decision authored by Chief Justice Roberts that gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act, which used to require states with a long history of discrimination like Georgia and Texas to receive pre-approval in order to enact voter suppression laws like what we've seen since. So a lot is at stake here. And the number 13 is significant because it would once again allow for a pro-democracy majority to govern the Supreme Court, a majority of justices who agree with Roe v. Wade, and who, for that matter, would respect the will of Congress, which passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and reauthorized it in 2006 unanimously in the Senate, for example, only for it to be gutted just a few years later by a rogue right-wing majority.
So changing topics very quickly, Congressman, what, if anything, do you tell your constituents right now about what Washington can do to deal with inflation?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I feel your pain. You know, I shop at the grocery store just like everybody else, and I've seen the prices rise. I've got a car that requires gas. I've seen the prices go up. One thing among many that Democrats have been working to do is enact a minimum wage that is $15 so that wages will go up and so that people are better able to afford mundane trips to the grocery store and to the gas station. But beyond that, we just passed in the House legislation that would address the supply chain crisis. So we would be able to produce more goods domestically. And as a result, you'll see prices go down as supply increases to meet demand. It is also the case that Build Back Better would cut inflation by raising wages and creating good paying jobs. Thankfully, we did pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill last fall, which is now law. That's going to create millions of good paying jobs that are going to allow people to better able afford the daily cost of living.
Congressman, I've been around Washington for many, many years, and I've seen gas price spikes encourage talk about a federal gasoline tax holiday. There's now renewed talk about that. Not the first time I've seen it. Are you in favor of that? Do you think that's a solution?
I think all options have got to be on the table. Look, there's only one major political party in this country trying to ensure that working class folks have a chance to live in dignity in this economy, and that's the Democratic Party. And so we've got to have that on the table, along with a number of other things that have been discussed. And I'm looking forward to making that case and to passing additional legislation. Of course, the president using his own executive authority to do what he can in the face of unprecedented Republican obstruction when it comes to building an economy that works for everybody.
Congressman, as you well know, 30 House Democrats have announced that they will not seek re-election this year. Real quickly, that seems to me a number incompatible with Democrats retaining control of the House after the midterms.
Well, as you look at the dozens of retirements, which have also occurred on the Republican side, you'll see that the vast majority of those retirements have been in seats that are so-called safely blue seats. So it's not incompatible with keeping the majority. In fact, redistricting, despite the partisan gerrymandering and voter suppression that we've seen on the Republican side, is going better because of the litigation of folks like Mark Elias and, of course, Eric Holder's group. But it's a shame that we even have to deal with a situation where districts are drawn by elected officials rather than voters choosing their own elected officials. That's called partisan gerrymandering. And we had a bill that would have ended that practice. It was called the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. I'm proud to have authored key provisions of that legislation. It passed the House recently, but unfortunately, along with the voting rights components of that bill, was filibustered in the United States Senate by Republicans.
Congressman Mondaire Jones, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.